One, I am not a professional mechanic. I am a home hobbyist. I'm a retired nuclear trained naval officer, former submarine captain. I have been working on my own cars for probably 50 years now. I do it because one, I enjoy it, and two, I don't think I could, have these cars if I had to pay somebody to work on it myself, to work on them. I do these tech sessions because I want to encourage people to work on their own cars. A lot of these cars, I think, are almost unaffordable if you don't work on them yourself, and they're usually not that awful to work on. I mean, it's really kind of Mercedes are generally designed to be maintained, and so you can actually usually work on them yourself. Now, when I do these tech sessions, I don't do a step-by-step on a procedure. I kind of go do the overview, and then I talk about the things that I had difficulty doing, special tools and stuff like that. So don't expect a step-by-step. There's plenty of those out there. This is kind of the things especially that I had difficulty with and I want to alert you to. I also have a kind of maintenance philosophy since I spent my career being qualified for supervision, operation, and maintenance of Navy nuclear propulsion plants. I kind of take the philosophy of the way you maintain a submarine and maintain a propulsion plant, a nuclear plant, and I apply it to the way I work on cars. I call it kind of the nuclear approach. What is that? Well, it's things like always have a procedure. You're always working from a book. You're not winging it. You're having a procedure. Maintain cleanliness standards. When you're opening up something on the engine, you clean it off before you take it off so you don't have dirt fall into the engine. FME protection, which is foreign material exclusion. You open up a hose, open up something on the engine, you plug it, you make sure things can't fall in. And that's especially appropriate for what we're going to talk about tonight. There's some really big holes you open up for a really long time. You've got to make sure things don't fall in them, especially say for the intake or for the timing chain covers. Bagging and tagging parts. I always work with a couple of different bags of Ziploc bags or boxes of Ziploc bags. I use snack size most of the time. I use quart size for larger things, and I always have a paint pen. I write what they are on it, bag it, put it down in order, and so they're in the order I took them off, so that when I go back to put the car back together, I have a reassembly sequence based on the order that I took the parts off in. I said I find that very, very helpful. Now, of course, you have to have the parts and supplies on hand. You research the job, you order everything you need to do the job, and you make sure you have it on hand. Now, this job, some extras would have been nice. I wish I'd had an extra set of valve cover gaskets and an extra set of intake manifold gaskets. Sometimes it's just nice to have extra pieces too. You do the research to see if any special tools are available. There are a couple of instances in the sequence of jobs I'm going to talk about where special tools were necessary. I love special tools. I go out of my way to buy special tools, but some of them don't work very well either. And there's a really good workaround in here that I'll tell you about. You need torque wrenches. Now, to do jobs on a car, you basically need 3 sizes of torque wrenches. Why do you need 3 sizes? To appropriately use a torque wrench, you need to stay within 1/4 to 7/8 of the scale of the torque wrench. Torque wrenches are not very accurate at the extreme ends of their scale, and so you'll have one that you use most of the time, which is probably going to be 10 to 80 foot-pounds. Then you need a little one that's probably going to be in inch-pounds, and then you need a bigger one that might be 80 to 150 foot-pounds for things like lug bolts and things like that. So you really need 3. Now, keep a log. You want to know what you did with the car. In fact, preparing for this, I went back to my log on this car and read about all the pages of work I'd done that I'm going to be talking about. But you need to be able to go back and see to help you troubleshooting and see the last time you changed something, like the timing chain. Of course, take the time to do it right. Do not rush. If you don't have the time to do it right the first time, where are you going to get the time to redo it? And the last point about the nuclear approach is there's always a retest. Everything you do to a car, there's a retest. It might be as simple as when you do an oil change and you are restarting the car, you check the oil filter to make sure that it's not leaking. Just basic things. And sometimes there's other retests. You do an electrical test to see that a component functions before you button everything up. But there's always a retest, and sometimes there's multiple retests. And of course, take lots of pictures so you can document the way it came apart so you know how to put it back together. Okay, so let's get into the topic a little bit. The references for this one, I used a Haynes manual. It's always handy to have one of those around. And I was working on a 73 450 SL. It's a car with a D-Jetronic fuel injection. So I was managed to find a D-Jetronic fuel injection manual, which with my virtual background isn't showing up, but it is a D-Jetronic manual. And there's a book I think you should have if you have one of these cars, and it's called Preventing Catastrophic V8 Engine Failure. It's by Pete Bergsma of Mercedes Source. Just go buy the book. Okay, it's a really useful book. It does have procedures for several of the things I'm going to talk about in here. And if you have one of these engines, you need to know this stuff. And I'll make a point of that, the major points as we go on. And of course, the workshop information manual, the online R107 manuals from Mercedes. So I'm going to do a screen share now and go get a picture of the car up that I'm talking about here. And share. Okay, you should see a car. Do you? Do you?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Go full screen on that. Okay, so this is the car that we're talking about. It's a 73 450 SL. This car sat out, ignored for years beside somebody's house. And some of my friends found it and got it and started trying to get it back to operational shape. The odometer was showing 63,000 miles. It's probably not accurate because it turned out it didn't work. My friends made it drivable and got the engine running, sort of. And they fully disclosed what they knew about it and gave me their service records. Of course, because of the way it was discovered, there were no other service records. So we knew nothing about the background of the car. And I also pointed out I'd never touched an M117 engine before. Now, the neat thing about these cars is it's D-Jetronic fuel injection. That was the up until 75. And it's a system that I really like. Back when I was racing, the cars I was racing had a D-Jetronic, and you had to keep the D-Jetronic system on them. And so I had a fair amount of experience with this system, and it's a system I just really like. It also is a car that has basic points. And if you remember, when we had distributors and rotors and distributor caps and points and all that kind of stuff, and it brings you back to those things with the manual timing adjustment and manual points gaps adjustment. And of course, it also doesn't have a catalytic converter. And I'm going to come out of sharing for a second. And it also, it has manual valve adjustment, which we'll get to in here. There's a special tool that you really kind of need for that. But, and no catalytic converter. So the issue with the car was that the idle just didn't sound right. It was pretty low. It was really kind of lumpy. And the part throttle response was awful. I mean, it started get 2,000 to 3,000 RPM would be backfiring, missing, really weak and unsteady. It was just unacceptable for driving. And so I started troubleshooting it. And it kind of did the basic things, look at the idle speed and set the dwell and the timing. The idle speed was really low, and I had to turn the idle air control about 2 turns out to get the idle up to where it's supposed to be. Now, anytime you have to do that drastic adjustment, you've got a problem. And so I tried to figure out what the problem was. With this system, the fuel pressure is supposed to be 28 PSI. So I went in and manually adjusted the fuel pressure. It was at like 31.5. So that wasn't really the problem. Then I started trying to figure out if the problem was limited to one cylinder. And so with the car at idle, I started pulling the injector plugs, and that turned into a problem. And then the ejector plug kind of started falling apart on me. They're plastic plugs. Of course, it's 50-year-old plastic, and they were brittle, and it was just falling apart. So I stopped doing that. I kind of took a note that I needed to work on those. But of course, that could have been part of the problem too, with the D-Jetronic plugs falling apart. Now I measured the vacuum. The manifold vacuum was like 13.5 to 14 inches, which is too low. and I started looking around for vacuum leaks. Now, I will say that the D-Jetronic system is pretty tolerant of vacuum leaks. D-Jetronic is pretty much the first electronic injection system, and it works by inferring the airflow. It doesn't have a mass airflow sensor. It infers the airflow from measuring the manifold vacuum. And so if there's a vacuum leak, it essentially is metered air, and the system sort of compensates for it. So it's nowhere near as bad as most systems are for vacuum leaks, but it still doesn't like vacuum leaks. And so I was with the car at idle, I was spraying carburetor cleaner around things that I thought might be leaking and listening for a change in the idle. And I found leaks at the intake gaskets, the plenum seals on the intake manifold, and several injectors. And so clearly I had to do some work with the intake manifold and those leaks. And I went on and set the idle CO on carbon monoxide level, which is, the way you set mixture on these cars. Didn't make a difference. Replaced the distributor cap, rotor, air filter, didn't make a difference. So I pulled the intake manifold. After ordering a bunch of stuff, I'm going to go back to screen share here. And there. And go to another photo. Okay. Now this is the picture of the intake manifold after I did all the work on it. Now, I'm going to point out some things about this intake manifold. And let me go to the next slide for just a second. This intake manifold has a plenum on the bottom that is separate from it, and it is attached to it by rubber rings. And one of these rubber rings is a place that I had found a vacuum leak. So this was the motivation to take this thing off the car, was really to go after these rings and fix the vacuum leaks. So let me go back to it. So what you see here, though, is what I ended up doing is taking the injectors off, sending all the injectors out to a shop to have them tested, make sure they were acceptable. Meanwhile, I had this off. I did those plenum seals, as I said, but I also replaced all of the fuel lines in the engine compartment. Now, that's important for a D-Jetronic system. You have a bunch of lines up here that have about 30 PSI in them. And a lot of these cars kind of disappeared in flames because of fuel leaks. And so you have to be very diligent about replacing fuel lines. And of course, you've got a fuel line that goes to every injector down in here, as well as the fuel lines that come up from the tank and that go to the pressure regulator. So there's a lot of fuel lines, and you really ought to replace every one of them when you're dealing with a car of unknown age and unknown maintenance practices. I also changed every hose clamp except for these two back here. I had a lot of what we call Yankee clamps if you've had the Concours course, and I replaced them with the correct hose clamps. But some of the things I learned from doing this intake manifold are you have to be really, really careful on a couple of the pieces that can fall into the wrong position when the manifold's out. There's this linkage that goes down to the transmission on this side, and behind here, there's a vertical link that comes up to the throttle. And I had a really hard time because I wasn't diligent about making sure that they stayed up while the manifold was out. It would probably be best to just tie them up. I did not do that. And I ended up putting the manifold back on, and I went through some awful machinations to get the transmission piece back on. And I found out I could not get the throttle piece back on because it was sitting in the down position, and it rotates to go all the way back up. And I ended up taking the intake manifold back off again just so I could get that link in the correct position so I could hook it up. And so that was a little bit on the painful side, and it's why I wished I had another set of intake manifold gaskets, because I think I actually just waited, ordered some and waited for them to come. And of course, I extensively cleaned everything. I had also, I mentioned to you that the fuel injection plugs were falling apart, and I found a company in England that sold an entire set of the plugs and of all of the boots for the D-Jetronic system. And so I meticulously went through and changed every plug on the D-Jetronic system and every boot that went on the plugs on that system. because that could have been one of the problems that was causing the car to run badly. Plus, I don't like things falling apart on my cars. So this really was a pretty extensive maintenance action. I also want to point out, if you can see where my my pointer is back here, you see all these brown wires coming in? You probably know that on a Mercedes, a brown wire is a ground. And there's a bunch of these, which I believe are the injector grounds, that ground to the intake manifold right here. If these don't have a good connection, the car will not run right. And if you notice how dark it is there, I used a product that is a conductive grease to help the grounds stay, good grounds. Now that's not the dielectric grease that we often use, say in distributors. The dielectric grease prevents corrosion, but it also is non-conductive, and gets squeezed out, so you still have a good connection. But if you use grease that actually has carbon in it and it's conductive, it'll be better for long-term health of a ground. So that's why I point that out. That's just a tube of grease I keep around for things like that.
Gary, I think we do have a question here. I think that's appropriate right here, and that's about how you cleaned up the engine. I mean, this picture is of the engine afterwards. So,
well, I had the intake manifold off, and so I sit there with probably brake cleaner, carburetor cleaner, and a bunch of Q-tips and a big vat to contain all the stuff that drips off of it, and just meticulously go through every nook and cranny until it doesn't have any dirt in it anymore. And I cleaned the valley too. You can't really get to the valley under it with the intake manifold on the car. And I found a 3/8 inch drive 6-inch extension in the valley, but I put a derusting agent in the valley as well. But I just was very meticulous about making sure there was not a spot of dirt left on it. Now, also, I point out the FME cover that I use, foreign material exclusion cover, in here to make sure nothing falls in. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, so there was a lot to this intake manifold refresh. I'm looking at there. Oh, I replaced almost all the coolant lines on the car, and I also replaced the coolant. The coolant was green. And, coolant in these cars should not be green. And I used Xerox G05, which is an acceptable Mercedes coolant. You can also use Mercedes coolant from the dealer. But comment, it was easier to install the second time I put it on. But, so put all that together, and, it just really didn't help the car run much better, which was pretty disappointing after all that work. So I went ahead and replace the spark plugs and the spark plug wires. And almost by coincidence, since I had laid in a new manifold pressure control sensor off of eBay as part of my quest to make sure I had spare parts for the car, I rotated that in just to test that it worked. And the amazing piece was the part throttle drivability issues went away. So that was actually caused by the MPC sensor. So that was refreshing, but the idle still was pretty bad. And the MPC sensor, I don't think, controls it at idle anyway. So then I had to continue to press forward. And the obvious thing to do is to go look under the valve covers. And I knew that I needed to adjust the valves because we had no indication of when that had ever been done. So I pulled the cam covers, or the valve covers, and I set the engine to top dead center on number 1. That's the manifold pressure control sensor, by the way. Okay, so this is just the engine set at top dead center with a lot of paint marks on it. And so you set it to top dead center, and then you go look at what the marks on the cam are. And this was the right side, i.e. passenger cam, and you see that this line is not lined up with that line. And so that cam is pretty much out of time. That's a problem. And so what you do then is you rotate the engine until these two markers line up, and then you go and see where the crankshaft is. Now, this is the driver's side, and this is the really scary part, because if you look at this, see these marks up here in the chain cover area? That means that the chain has been whipping around and hitting the cover. Now, I didn't hear that at all, so it probably didn't happen when I was driving it, but at some time, this chain has had enough slack in it to actually eat gouges in the timing chain cover, and that's a problem. So when I lined up the right side cam, this is what I found down at crank. And this is about 16 degrees after top dead center. And you refer to that as chain stretch, even though it's not just all chain stretch generally, but that's really a problem. More than about 9 degrees or so is really a problem. And in fact, if you're off one tooth on the cam, it's 18 degrees out down on the crank. And so this was almost a tooth off. It makes you think maybe it actually had jumped time at some time. And so, that motivated me to want to make sure that I changed everything that could impact the what we call chain stretch. And to look at this picture, I almost put parentheses around chain stretch, because chain stretch in these cars isn't just the timing chain wearing and getting longer. If you look at this diagram of the timing chain, if these sprockets wear, then the chain is going to sit down farther in the sprockets. And so that contributes to a chain that would be looser, i.e. chain stretch. If any of these guides wear, they can potentially wear a slot in these guides, then the chain's going to be looser. And yes, the tensioner can take up for some of that, but the tensioner can also be old and weaker. And so, I decided what I was going to do was replace the two sprockets up here that I could get to easily, replace the upper timing chain guides, as well as replacing the timing chain. Now, this is an important point out of Kent Bergsma's booklet. If these timing chains guides tend to be plastic, and plastic gets old and brittle, as I think I mentioned previously, and especially this one over here, if it breaks, you can actually have a piece of the guide be carried up by the chain and end up between the sprocket and the chain. And when that happens, the car will jump time. You'll have valves hit the pistons, and you're in for a really, really big repair. And so for these cars, you've got to know how old your guides are. And maybe 10 years or so is probably old enough for them, and then go back in and change them. And we had no clue how old they were on this car. And so I went in and changed those. I changed the sprockets, and I changed the timing chain, as we're going to talk about now. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, though, is the cam oiler tube. Now, that's this tube right here. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but let me show you a diagram of it. Now, this is the oiling diagram for this engine. And if you see, the oil comes up to get to the cam, it comes up in here, and then it goes out to an external tube, and it's distributed to the cam bearings and also sprays to the cam lobes up here. Now, this is a aluminum tube, and it's got plastic fittings that attach it and allow the oil to flow through. Now, plastic, 50 years old, gets brittle. Now, what can happen with these cars is that this tube can fall off. It just falls down into the valve cover, and suddenly your cam isn't getting any lubrication for any of the front bearings. You should hear something if that happens, and then hopefully you'll stop driving the car and get it investigated and repaired. If you ignore the problem, then the cam bearings will eat themselves. It'll probably break the cam towers. It's very likely it will break the timing chain, and valves will hit the pistons. And then again, you're in for a really expensive repair. If you do not know how old these little plastic pieces are in your cam oiler tube, you should just go in and change them. And these parts are probably $15. I mean, they're really cheap, and replacing them is really easy. And Kent Bergsma provides you a step-by-step on how to do that in there. But So that's one of the really important points here. You've got to know how old your cam oiler tube plastic pieces are, and you've got to know how old your upper timing chain guides are. All right, so let's go ahead to the rest of the work here. The other
Gary,
stuff.
Gary, I'm going to stop you for just a second to go
Okay.
back. Okay. I think this is a relevant, very important question right here about you know, the about confirming that whether it's your opinion whether to check the timing chain guides based on the number of years or not mileage. Is you think that time is more important, you know, the calendar is than the actual running of the engine?
Yeah, I've never seen anybody talk about doing that on a mileage basis. I've always seen it time, and I'm thinking maybe 10 years. I'll show you here in a minute that the guide that I got to put in this engine was not as good as the original guide in that it was plastic and the original guide had metal on it. So I think the replacement guides probably have a shorter life than the Mercedes original guides too. And I see another question there about coolant. Yeah, the pink stuff, Porsche uses that pink one, G40 as well. The G05 is the one for the older cars. Just, you have to be careful about fluids in Mercedes, as you probably know. Automatic transmission fluids change, oils change, and coolant changes. G05 is usually safe for the older cars like the 124s, the 107s, and such. And then you get into the really new cars and you get into that unusual pink stuff, but then I don't have any newer cars. Okay, one of the other questions is on topic. What I've read about to time change the timing chain is about 150,000 miles or so. The question says I've got a 560 SL with a total of 272,000 miles. I would go and look at the oilers, oiler tubes, and I'd go measure the what I was referring to as chain stretch and see where you are. And that'll probably tell you whether it's time to change the timing chain or not. And if you're going to change the guides, you might as well change the upper sprockets because you got to take them off to get the guides off.
No, he says it's got 272 miles, not 272,000 miles.
Oh, okay. 272 miles. I would look very carefully to see if you have chain stretch, and I would change the guides and the cam oiler tubes, and your chain's probably going to be okay. All right, so I mentioned that the really old 450 SLs, 75 and earlier, have manual valve adjustment. And this is the tool that you will want to do a manual valve adjustment on one of these cars. This makes it so much better. It's a 17mm offset, but you see this little cutaway at the bottom. It makes it fit perfectly on top of the adjuster. It's a Hazit 329-4, and I got a couple on eBay. They're getting quite a bit more expensive than they used to be, but I think they're still generally, around $100 or less. You've just got to have this tool to do the valve adjustment. And, for this car's valve adjustment, they were all pretty far off first. They were very, very stiff. I was using a long breaker bar with an extension on it just to have enough strength to move them. And I think they're really kind of intended to be that way so they don't unintentionally move. And of course, you have to turn the engine over a bunch of times when you're doing this. And so the best way to do that is to remove the fan, remove the fan shroud, and I remove the upper radiator hose as well, just so you can get access to the nut on the front of the engine to use to turn the engine over. And of course, doing a valve adjustment, you have to turn it over a lot, and changing the timing chain, you have to turn it over a lot. So it's useful to do that. I also found my cam oilers when I got in there were in good shape. I changed them anyway, but they were in good shape. So this sequence, I'm doing the sprockets and the upper guides. And a very important piece here is that you should always keep some tension on the timing chain. You do not want the timing chain to fall off its sprockets at the bottom or fall into the chain housing and potentially kind of get bound up. They can kind of roll in on each other and then bind up, and you just do not want a chance for that to happen. And a lot of the manuals talk about working with the second person to keep the tension on the chain. I always work alone. what I did is I screwed a couple of screw eyes up into the ceiling and used ropes and bungee cords to always maintain the tension on the chain. It also comes in handy when you're trying to put the sprocket back on, because it's really pretty hard to get these sprockets on working against the chain.
Mm.
This is a picture of my arrangement to can have tension on the chain.
And we also have a question here about, for a 560, are metal guides available versus the plastic?
I've never seen a metal guide. And the original guides are plastic over metal. You wouldn't want a guide that was metal itself. You'd want a guide that had, plastic over a metal frame. But as far as I can tell, what we're getting now are mostly plastic guides. The one for the tensioner is a piece of plastic that goes over a piece of metal and you replace the plastic. And we have a Nora answers that question as well. Okay. So this is a picture of the front of the right side timing cover after the alternator has been removed. And I include this to point out the special tool that you need to do these guides. Here and here are pins that are internally threaded that one must remove to pull the guide, which is back in here. And I'll also point out my FME covers here. I've got this opening here stuffed, and this area where you could drop things down into the chiming chain cover is very heavily protected. Although for this work, since the guide's got to come out, you've got to pull some of that out. Now, to remove these internally threaded pins, Mercedes sells a special tool, which I have, which is a slide hammer. And you thread a rod in and use a slide hammer to pull them out. And I've never seen that tool actually work. The way to get these out is by using a much cheaper, simpler tool. And all this is a long bolt with some nuts on it. Now, these are 10 millimeter headed, so it's an M8 bolt, but this is probably not one that you're going to have on your shelf, because you should use a 10.9 hardness bolt and 10.9 hardness nuts on it because of the stress that you're going to put on it. And I special ordered 10.9 bolts and nuts to make this one up. And of course, this is just a stack of washers that are bigger than the pin. You screw the bolt in and then start tightening the nut to extract. And it works really, really well. You'd be surprised how much torque you have to put on it to actually unscrew it. But it works really, really well, much better than the $100 and something Mercedes tool. And this is a picture of the tool, and then this is the pin that you pull out. And after many, many years, they can be really tight. This is a picture of the new guide, which is the total plastic one. And this is an original guide that has the metal on it, which makes me think this car had never had the guides changed before. You can also see a little bit of a divot having been worn in this guide by the chain, although this one isn't in too bad a shape. This is the tensioner guide, and the new tensioner guide comes as two pieces. It's the metal piece and then the plastic wear piece on top of it. But look at the channels that are worn in this one. Okay, and that certainly showed me that this needed to be changed.
Yeah, we got a couple questions here about, one is about the lower guides. Eric says they look impossible to replace when replacing the chain in the upper plastic guides on a 77 450 SL. The new lower guides are still sitting in a box. How critical is it to replace the lower plastic guides?
Well, I'd say most people don't. And if you look at this picture, the lower guides are way down here. In fact, let me go back to the other schematic here. Where was that one? I want to show you there. Notice what you have to do to get the lower guides. The chain drive for the oil pump is in front of it, so you have to disassemble massive amount of the front of the engine and pull the chain off for the oil pump to actually get to the point where you can remove the lower timing chain cover and get to those guides. And so if you got the engine out of the car and you're rebuilding the engine, you change those, but you don't typically do it for this maintenance action. So I'd say it's not as important. You'd love to do it, but it is so hard to do it. It's probably not worth taking the time.
Okay. And then Michael Latino asked about when you're, did you remove the rockers to keep the cams from jumping from spring tension?
No, I didn't have a problem with that. They just didn't.
Okay.
I,
And then did you replace the pins like you do the guides?
no, the pins are not really wear items. They're hard steel, and you don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
But yeah, I read about the cams moving, but they just didn't move, and I didn't have an issue with that. But you have to be very careful to make sure that you don't lose timing on it. That is a consideration, but you pay attention to it. But I didn't have a problem with that. Okay, so I've shown you those. All right, so here I am. This is a sequence replacing one of the guides, and I'm using a bunch of bungees to keep the chain tight. You notice the sprocket's off because you can't get the guide out with the sprocket on. The guide's down in here, and I'll show you. Here are the pins being reinserted, and this is the new guide being put in. And you really want to look and make sure that you're really going in the holes in the guide. You can see with a flashlight down here to see that you're really getting them in the right place. Okay? And you really want to be certain that you're in the holes. I mean, I think it's probably possible to put these in and have the guide in the wrong position and make it feel like that it's in the hole when it's not. Okay. And then here's finally putting the sprocket back on. I bought new sprockets. The sprockets wear, and instead of kind of U-shaped valleys and kind of rounded teeth, they end up being a much sharper teeth. And that tells you it's kind of an older, more worn sprocket, and that can cause a slacker chain. And then not even that expensive. They are hard to get on. This is where it would be really nice to have a second person to pull it up. I put a rope on this one and pulled up on it and got it back on. This was not the last time that I had to pull this one off either. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But you can also see the protection I'm giving to not dropping things in. All right, so we've gotten all that put back together, and the surprise for me was as I was after I'd already done the sprockets, I'd done the guides, and then I measured the chain stretch again, and it was unchanged. So despite those big divots that you saw and the sprockets, it didn't change this chain stretch measurement. Now I was planning to change the chain anyway, but that was a little disconcerting. So to replace the chain, you grind off a little bit of one of the chain links so you can pull it out, and you put a master link in. And one way you can tell whether your chain's ever been replaced before is that you look at it and see if it's got one of these master links or not. And this one did not. So, grinding on something hard metal like that, you get pieces of metal all over the place. And so one of my cleanliness things was to drape the entire engine compartment in sheets, exposing only the place that I was going to grind. And this is a close-up of it. We're going to grind off the heads of these two, which allows the link to be taken apart. And this is after grinding so that the link can be removed. And this is the master link. On the right side is the old chain. On the left side is the new chain. So you use a master link to put the old chain and the new chain together. And notice still I'm protecting this area. I was very nervous about dropping these little C-clips into the timing cover. And so I had extensive protection there to prevent that. I think I even had a magnet nearby too, so it'd be less likely they'd drop down there. And this part of the job, this is one of the easiest things to do. This is changing this timing chain is probably easier than replacing the intake manifold on this car. As the strategy is you just put the chains together and you roll the new chain in. Now you still have to maintain tension on the chain the entire time. And the book tells you to have a second person with you to do this. I did this with 3 very small vice grips. I taped the teeth, the jaws, to pad them and rotated the engine. And when I got to where I couldn't rotate anymore, I just put the other vice grip in, say up here, remove that one, rotate another, third of a rotation, and then swap them again. and you draw the new chain in and you pull the old chain off. And when you've got all new chain in there, then you pull that master link and this master link the chain back together, and you've got a new timing chain. But go measure chain stretch. And when I did this measurement, I was very surprised to find that I had 9 degrees of stretch still. And that's a problem. It's especially a problem because if you take this sprocket and move it 1 tooth on the chain, that adjusts the position by 18 degrees down at the crank. So if you have to adjust something less than 18 degrees, you use what's called an offset Woodruff key. And I had bought every size available of offset Woodruff keys, and you use them to change the position of the cam with respect to the sprocket. And this is the workshop manual page that tells you how to do it and which direction to put the offset keys in. And so I ended up using an offset Woodruff key on the right cam to correct the timing. And in fact, one of the little subtleties in the workshop manual is it actually tells you to set the right cam 2 degrees advanced. I think what they're trying to do is to make up for the initial wear on the cam so it wears into the correct position. And so I did set it that way. This is the left side cam line. That's parallax. It actually is lined up pretty well. And this is the right side cam, the one I was really worried about. And it is lined up basically perfectly here, but with an offset key to do that. And then my little embarrassing time when I had the car quit. 2 times during this maintenance, the car actually quit. And one of them was, this is the fuel filter that I took off when I was troubleshooting that quitting time. It turned out the car had a fuel gauge that stuck at 1/3 of the tank, and I had just run out of fuel. And I am embarrassed to tell you how long I spent troubleshooting, figuring that out. But so that was kind of fun. One of the other times it quit when I was just about done, and I had swapped the manifold pressure control back into it, and it started running again. And I put the original, the good one back in, and it ran again. And all my problem is that the manifold pressure control sensor had come on the electrical connector had come out a little bit. And that kind of caused it to quit. So, bottom line of the major content here is that if you have one of these cars, pay attention to the cam oilers, pay attention to the upper chain guides, and pay attention to this thing we call chain stretch. I have read that 150,000 miles is probably about when the timing chain ought to be replaced, but go look at the car and see how much of this chain stretch you have, and base your decision on that. Because my car was showing 63,000 miles. Now I think it had really been neglected for a long time. I'm not sure the oil changes were done at an appropriate time, and any of those can shorten the life of the timing chain. But those 3 things really matter. All right, I'm going to come out of screen sharing here and try to address questions. Do we have some other questions?
Well, going back to the early on, I think you talked about this company that makes these boots out of England, and the question was related to who that company is.
Yeah, I'd have to do that. I did that for a fair while back, so I'm not sure who that is. I'll go and try to figure that out.
Yeah, the name of the company in England that sells the boots. Let's see, we got a couple other questions here. Are we able to share pictures in this chat? The answer is no. It's a security thing.
Okay.
Are there MES, are there parts available through the Classic Center or other dealers?
Well, yeah, parts are a funny thing. Sometimes you find 107 parts just fine in the regular Mercedes dealer parts network. Other times you call the Classic Center, you can find something. Other times they'll tell you, we don't have that. And I've found a lot of things on eBay. And I'm not beyond using used parts if I have to use used parts, if that's all I can get. I've gotten parts from Latvia. Sometimes that's what it takes to get a quality part. So I mean, parts are an issue. And one of the things I found when I called the Classic Center, I was looking for the electrical connector that goes on the neutral safety switch. And my car didn't have any plastic left at all. It's just 4 conductors there that are plugged in, and that is not available. You could probably get a used one on eBay though, and I've gotten some used ones for my 109 that way. That's a challenge. I mean, you have to use all different methods you can to try to figure out parts.
Okay, so Jeffrey, I did make you a co-host, so if you want to screen share, you can screen share if you've got the picture of that tool. Okay.
Yeah, Jeff, and go ahead and unmute and tell us what you're showing
And
us.
tell us about it. There you go.
Yes, I was just getting the picture. So this is a tool that was shared with me from a Mercedes mechanic that worked at the local Mississippi Mercedes dealership, and we just did a valve, timing chain replacement, and actually went through an entire intake manifold. Replaced all the gaskets and everything on a 560 SL.
Yeah, we're not seeing anything, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I'm about to share it.
Oh, okay, got it.
And let me share. Hang on a second. Let me get it pulled up. There you go. I apologize.
Well,
I got it.
Yeah, sometimes sharing on Zoom can be a little funny.
Yeah. All right. Now I'm sharing this. Can you see that for now?
I see Jeffrey
Coming
has
up.
started screen sharing, but it's black.
There you go.
Okay, got it.
There you go. So this is a tool that actually bolted. You took the front 2 cam bolts out that held the cam in place, and then you put those bolts right back in, and it actually holds the chain in place.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has that opening little window there that you can cut the chain apart and then attach your new chain, and then you just literally roll your crankshaft and it just pulls the new chain in and keeps all the tension that you need on it. It's a pretty neat tool. I don't think it's not a Mercedes tool. It was an aftermarket tool. Never seen one like it anywhere else, but I'm actually just been sitting here thinking I could probably get this thing 3D printed, scanned
So
and 3D.
So it kind of it sits in the same position, and the sprocket rolls under it, and it stays tight enough to hold the chain on it. That's neat.
Yes.
I'd
Yeah.
have to see that. That's neat. I like
I have a
that.
video of it in action, actually. Now it's kind of a long video. If I can maybe work for a few minutes, and then if I can get it to pull up on my computer, I can show that video in action.
Suggesting you post it on our YouTube channel, but
Yeah, I mean I can. But
if you could send the video to Gary or me, I could put my email address in here. We could get it out there.
yeah, I'd like to see that. That'd be kind of neat. Yeah, I love special tools. Okay.
Yeah, and like I said, I've never seen it anywhere else, but I work at a local community college where they let us come in and use their 3D printers and stuff. I could probably get some of these 3D printed and made. So
That's neat. Okay, well, I appreciate learning about that. That's neat. Hopefully I won't ever have to do one of these again, but you never know.
right.
Any other questions? It's okay to ask questions. You can even unmute and ask questions. Okay, well, don't see a lot of questions.
Hi, I have a question referring to the oiler tubes. I have an M100 6.9. Does it have the same oiler tubes that you refer to?
I don't know that. I've got an M100 6.3. I don't think they do, because I've never read about it for the 6.3. I don't think so. It's a good question though.
I see a few people nodding their heads.
Is it a yes or no?
Nodding heads, yes.
Okay, I need to look that up then. I think I've got some pictures of my 6.3 with the cam cover off, but I don't think I can locate them fast enough to figure it out. But that's a good question. I can go look that up because since I got a 6.3, I'm kind of interested in that. Other questions?
Gary, quick question. So I just finished putting a new timing chain in my 560. While I've got the distributor, the alternator, the power steering pump out of the way, I'm toying with the idea of just going ahead and replacing the water pump. Thoughts? What's your thoughts?
Is it leaking?
It's not.
How many miles are on the water pump?
Well, I don't know for sure. So it shows 88K, but I've got reason to believe it's more than that.
I don't know. I mean, it depends on what you want to do. Yeah, if it were a Porsche 996, I'd say you're 20,000 miles beyond when you should have replaced it. Mercedes don't quite have the same type of issues with things falling apart early like that on. So I don't know. I may not do that.
Mhm. Let's see, a couple questions here in chat. Are the metal oiler tubes all available? Can you get them?
Well, the tube is fine. It's not the tube that you have to worry about.
No, the question is, are they
Yes.
available?
I don't know, and I wouldn't have a problem using a used one either.
And then Steve asked about, he has a 75 450 SL. It gets terrible gas mileage. Any idea why it runs so rich?
Okay, 75, because that's a D-Jetronic car. They don't get very good gas mileage, but they really don't. But I mean, how bad is it? Unmute and let me answer.
Steve,
Still
how
there?
bad's the gas mileage? It gets about 11, and at 11, it now gets about 5.
5?
Have you checked your gas filler cap to make sure it's sealing? Because that can cause bad gas mileage.
Yeah.
No,
But-
filler cap. Okay, so you've been there.
And that you'd have to, I'd go through everything in the injection system and the fuel system to try to see what the hell's going on. I mean, are your brakes hanging up? I mean, that's another possibility. Do you have a brake caliper hanging up? I've had that issue. Of course, you tell that because, well, one, you'll get a lot of brake fade if it's really, really bad, and one of your wheels will be really, really hot. But I mean, I'd say it could almost be anything. I would look closely at the cold start valve. If the cold start valve is leaking, it'll cause it to run crappy, and it'll use more fuel. An injector leaking, but it will probably run badly too. At 5 miles a gallon, I'd expect black smoke too. But so bad injectors. You might swap the manifold pressure control sensor, see if that makes a difference. I mean, could be the engine's computer. I mean, I laid in a spare computer for mine just to try to make sure I had something in case I needed it. But that could be almost anything. It really requires comprehensive troubleshooting to try to figure that out, but that's pretty bad.
Let's hear, what is the best dollar for horsepower alteration edition on the stock SLs?
Oh, I can't answer that question. I don't modify these cars. Mercedes, as those of us that grew up in American cars, there were easy things to do in American cars. The Mercedes engines are really pretty optimized, and they don't respond quite as well to things to make them more powerful because they're really pretty good as they are. And so I just can't answer that question. I don't know. I'm sure there's some things. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. So we got another question for a 560 SEL. How can you check if you need to replace the injectors, and do you need to replace them all at once?
I sent my injector. I did a internet search and just found somebody that said that they tested injectors, and I took them all out and sent them off for replacement. And they said they were okay, and I put them back in. So, I mean, that's one way to test. And remember, I mentioned that I was pulling the injector plugs off one at a time until they started crumbling on me. I mean, if you've got good indication of what your idle RPM is, and you pull your injector plugs one at a time. I mean, every injector, every cylinder ought to have about the same amount of RPM drop. If you've got a cylinder that has more RPM drop, then there's a problem in that cylinder. Now, it could be the injector, it could be the valves, it could be the piston rings, but that's a way of trying to figure out. But you might just pull the injectors and send them off to somebody to test them and see. You might buy another set of injectors too if you can find some. Yeah, I'm paging through my Djetronic manual to the troubleshooting part to see if it's going to tell me anything about really awful fuel mileage.
Let's see here. Stephen S., new owner of an 88 560 SEL. Congratulations with 65K on it. Sounds like I should replace the cam oilers, check for links in the fuel line, and see how much chain stretch the timing belt has. Have I missed anything?
No, I mean, you should definitely look very carefully at your fuel lines. Up in the engine compartment, you should certainly look at the cam oiler tubes, and you should take a look at the chain stretch. And and I showed you those big gouges in my timing chain cover where the chain had been hitting. Go look over there and see if you have gouges. That's kind of a danger sign.
Thank you.
Excessive fuel consumption. The Djetronic manual says, check the following: defective sensors, ECU, MPC, improperly adjusted throttle switch, or inadequate fuel pressure. So there's some thoughts, some of which I had covered. The inadequate fuel pressure is an interesting one. It's got a fuel pressure regulator. You can just adjust it pretty easily to achieve the appropriate fuel pressure, which by the book is 28 PSI. Other thing that these cars are known for is vapor lock. And you can't ever really make it totally go away, but you can do things like adjust the fuel pressure to the highest end of the band, which forestalls vapor lock a little bit, and always start the car with your foot on the gas when it's hot. And it'll start and then it'll run kind of crappy for a while, and then it'll finally clear the vapor lock issues. But that's kind of one of the things these do, and the CIS cars do it too. Other questions? I see 19 new messages over there. Diana, am I keeping up?
Yeah, you're keeping up. You're good. Let's see. We got another one from one needs a fuel pump pressure regulator and a custom circuit to trigger the injector. The measure how much fuel is injected in 15 seconds or so. This is a comment. Compare multiple injectors and watch the spray pattern to find the outlier.
Yeah, that's a good comment. And they're not like CIS injectors, so you can't use a CIS injector test stand, and you can't use a mechanical injector test stand.
Yes, I did this myself. I had like 20 different injectors, and wanted to find out if my injectors are good or bad, and basically tested all of them. Turns out when you have 32 PSI on an injector and you trigger them, and they need to open for like 2 milliseconds, and then you close for 8 milliseconds, and you repeat the cycle. You can't open them all the time because then they burn through, so you destroy the injector. They've like react on 3 volts, right? So you apply a working cycle, and then they generate, they let through a certain amount of fuel. You catch that in a glass, let it run for 15 seconds, and do this with all the injectors. And I had 2 of them where the spray pattern was distinctively different, and they also didn't spray as much fuel, and they were problematic. And I used the same trigger mechanism to basically vibrate the injector like 2 milliseconds and 8 milliseconds, and put them into subsonic, ultrasonic bath, and that cleaned them all up. So all of my injectors, you don't need to send those out. With a fuel pump, compression regulator, pressure regulator, can do this all at home.
I'd be interested in hearing how you built the circuit to trigger them. That sounds really neat.
There's I think that I can give you the chip. It's an N555. It's a timing circuit with some capacitors and resistors. You can set it that it basically turns on the output for 2 milliseconds and turns it off for 8 milliseconds, whatever you want, right? So you can tune that. and basically you generate the 3 volts signal. It's just a, you know, rectangular pattern. And if you have an oscilloscope, you see what the output is, and you apply that to the injector, and you kind of hear it vibrating, and then everything is good. Right? That's what you want. So that's how I did it. I can send you the circuitry if you're interested. I had a spare pump and you know, just hooked it up basically into like a little jerry can, and pump out some fuel and let it run for 15 seconds, and then see how much fuel ended up in my glass jar. And that's all there is. And you see the spray pattern. It's very distinct. You know, is it spraying in one place or nicely spread out as you want it? And I bet the companies who charge you hundreds of dollars for doing that do the same thing.
I'm sure they do. Your electronic device to trigger them might be a little bit up beyond me, but that's fascinating. I appreciate your sharing that.
Yeah.
There's one thing I did not mention because it had already been changed on the car, but the D-Jetronic has a set of trigger points in the bottom of the distributor. And if they aren't opening and closing as they're supposed to, the injectors will not fire. There are 2 sets of trigger points. One does 4 injectors, the other does the other 4 injectors. And I actually did pull that and test it to make sure it really was working. That's hard to find today. They don't go
Okay, we
bad
got
either.
We have one more question here in chat here from Ron. I have a 1994 20 SEL, no chain stretch, good oilers, highway mileage is 15, and it has an intermittent hiccup. Any ideas?
Oh, that could be so many things. And you know, the first thing that comes to mind is a bad connection someplace in one of the wiring harnesses someplace that is going to be almost impossible to find. Can you repeat the problem? Can you make the problem happen? Or is it just really intermittent? Go ahead, unmute Ron and answer that. Oh, well, that could be almost anything. But I mean, I think I would go and look at the electrical connections first. I mean, anywhere in back to the ECU.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was had problems unmuting. Anyway, the car, I cannot predict when it's happening, and I only notice it on idling after it warms up.
Okay, warm idle. So you think temperature sensors for one thing, but it's got to be something intermittent since it doesn't stay. So, man, I would do a visual inspection of all your electrical wiring associated with the engine. You've got a CIS system, so it's got, you know, it's got different controls than the D-Jetronic does, but it really sounds like something intermittent in the electricals that's causing that. And, you know,
I have a suggestion.
Sure, go ahead. Who is this?
This is Mark Sheldon out of Pittsburgh. I had something similar, I used to take the battery terminals off of my 74 450 just as it sat, and I'd reinstall them, but I wouldn't tighten them. And I had the same thing happen. Intermittently, it would run and then it wouldn't start again, or it would die. And there's a positive, smaller wire connected. I assume it connected to the ECU or one of the other components that has to be tight, because if it loses any connection whatsoever, you lose spark, and you know you lose engine performance.
Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, I've replaced that whole wire with the new wire.
Okay.
And still occurs.
Yeah. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful, but that's got to be an internet.
Oh, no, that's right.
Yeah, and that's gonna be really hard to find.
Yeah, look for all the wire connections that you can trace back and make sure nothing's frayed, nothing's chewed on, because mice like to.
Do you think?
Nora had his hand
ground
up.
wires on them? Do you think that the ground wires on the manifold?
Yeah, he's got a CIS system, so the ground wires are a little different on that one. Nora, go ahead and answer it. Unmute. Nora, you're muted. Nora, go ahead and unmute yourself. Because I know you had your hand up.
Yeah, we also have a question about, is there any way to check the guide conditions without removing the valve covers?
Checking valve guide condition without removing the valve covers. Do a full throttle acceleration. Immediately lift your foot off the gas and look in the rearview mirror. If you see blue smoke, you've got bad valve guides. Okay, Nora, go ahead.
No, he's
Yeah.
looking for the guide condition, so.
Oh, you're talking not the valve guides. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Valves, yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, he's talking about I think he's
No.
talking about the chain guides, yeah. the
Well,
chain guides.
if you hear a rattle from the chain, you've got a problem. But go ahead, Nora.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Fuel pump relay. You pull them out, couple of little screwdrivers, you take the cover off, take a magnifying glass, and you'll find bad solder joints
Mhm.
because they were wave soldered and the solder joints are really thin on the components. And you'll find a little ring around the collar of whatever component is coming from the other side. And it doesn't take much to stop 12 volts. I mean,
Yep. Well, shoot, even the fuses, if you don't have the copper center fuses, if you've got the, the light colored aluminum fuses, that just corrosion on the fuses
oh
can
yeah,
give you the same type of thing.
yeah.
But yeah, I've got another car that's dying on me periodically that I'm just not looking forward to trying to fix, but I think it's probably going to be an issue with grounds. I'm sorry, chain guides. Now you really can't tell other than noise. If you've got a lot of chain rattle, then you've got to, go look and do something about it. You shouldn't hear chain rattle. Anybody else? Okay. All right. Well, I'll do a little homework trying to figure out where I bought those Digitronic boots and plastic connectors and if they're still in business, because that was a little bit ago when I did that.
I have a question, if that's all right.
Okay, Jeffrey, go ahead.
So yeah, I have a 300 SCL 4.5 with the 109 with that engine. And what's y'all's experience with the trigger points in the bottom of the distributor? Having issues with those? Have you ever had to deal with that?
They don't carry very much voltage, so the points don't burn up like your points in the distributor. The wear points are the little things that ride the cam to open and shut them, but they're really pretty reliable. It's also pretty hard to find them, but you can test them just by you basically have to pull the distributor to test them, but you can test them by reading the output and see that they're opening and closing as you turn the distributor. Yeah, I did that on this one and it was pretty straightforward. And you can probably even bend them if the little rubbing blocks have worn, you can probably even bend them out so they still work. I mean, even though they've got a bad reputation, I don't think you have a lot of problems with them.
Well, that's kind of what I was wondering. I mean, my first initial thought early on was, man, these things would burn out because they're like points, regular points, but they must not carry a lot of voltage because I haven't really had any problems with mine. And I just know that they're hard to find. And I just hope that they continue to rock on.
Well, a V8 has 2 sets of points and each set of points does 4 cylinders.
Four sets of points.
Well, I mean, if there's 4 points, but there's two. There's
4 points. They fire pairs of injectors.
Okay.
So you have 4 trigger points and the injectors fire in pairs.
Yeah, I think that is correct.
Okay. I really thought they did 4, but that's fine. But like I said, they don't carry much voltage, so they shouldn't really give you much of a problem. And you can test them just by reading the output.
We've seen them full of oil though.
Oh, that's a problem.
Engine oil comes up through the distributor shaft and everything's nasty in there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Distributor
Okay.
shaft seal.
There's one more question here in chat about the oil. I think it's supposed to be oil pump chain. Is it as important?
Replaced? I'm
Yeah.
not seeing that one, Diana.
Well, 808. Eric asked the question. I think oil pump chain is. I'm not sure what an oil pump chain is, but
I don't have a data point to answer that question. I'm not seeing, comments or issues on the oil pump chain. And of course, it's in front of the timing chain. And when people change the timing chain, they don't go in and do the oil pump chain because it's such a pain. So I don't think it is, but when you rebuild the engine, you'll change that.
Can I come in?
Eric, is it?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I replaced the timing chain, but I know the lower chain is there. So of course I didn't replace that because what I thought at the time, it looked like I had to remove the engine. So that's something that you do then when the engine is out.
Yeah, I would do that when I had access to it, but it doesn't seem to be as much of an issue on those cars. Anybody
Showing
else?
structure or anything like that. Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, well, I don't see any others. It's been my pleasure to present this to you, and I thank you for your questions. I thank you for your answers. I learned something as usual when I do this as well, and I really appreciate your spending time with us this evening. We